Okay. Thank you all very much indeed for inviting me. And well, the great train robbery. I look around the audience tonight and well, you look so young that I don't think many of you really remember the great train robbery, really. But anyway, I'll put it. I am coming up 73. So I was a teenager, and if you do remember it, it's 60 years ago this year. 60 years ago on the 8th of August. Right. So let's see how we go. So that's the train. That's after the event, towed into Cheddington Station. For the aficionados amongst you, the train geeks, it's an English Electric Type 4 D326. That's written on the side by the cab. And IM 44, a diesel electric with 12 carriages. Not 12 carriages as you know them. They were a travelling post office, and it had 72 sorters. It had auto sack catch and release. So this train started from the north, and it would either stop or it would release sacks of mail that had been sorted on the train as it went down the track. It stopped at the main conurbations, as I say, so places like Carlisle and that. Well, you can see actually on the map there. It started on the night before, so that's Wednesday the 7th at 10 to 7, and it started with 8 carriages at Glasgow Central. It was to travel down the line and arrive at Euston at 4 o'clock in the morning. But of course, it never got there, not that night anyway. This was a normal thing. This happened every day of the week, and it was pretty normal sort of thing to do. As it got to Carstairs, which was the first one, another 2 carriages which had been towed over from Edinburgh joined the train, and as it moved down to Carlisle, another 2, so those were the 12 carriages that were towed behind the train. 15 of 18 men robbed the train. They stole £2.6 million, worth about 58 million today. And they retrieved less than 400,000, 8 million today, after the event. Shout out if you want to ask questions along the way. There were, well, let's say a different time. Somebody mentioned black and white. We did. We had black and white television at the time. We only had 2 stations, BBC and ITV, and the news started at 6 o'clock in the evening. So really, during the day, if you wanted to know about the Great Train Robbery, it was radio and, of course, newspapers. And the newspapers made a field day. The main newspapers in London and around the country were producing something like 7 or 8 times their normal run of a newspaper for a day. This was the Express and Star. Pretty good, but I'm afraid they got the position wrong. If you see where it says ambush now above Leighton Buzzard, it didn't happen there. It happened south of Leighton Buzzard, so they didn't get the map quite right. But as you can see, that's where it was all happening. But it goes back before this. We're going back to November 1962. You had 2 big commercial organisations flying at that time, British Overseas Airways Corporation and BEA. They eventually merged together to the British Airways that we know today. But BOAC had their headquarters at Comet House at London Airport. And the Bowler Hat Gang, they were called at that time. 8 people 8 criminals, overpowered 2 security guards who were looking at the £62,500 payroll, and they drove away with the loot in 2 Jaguar 3.8 cars, which were the sort of choice of police and criminals at that time. Morse had something similar to that type of style of car. There was only one criminal caught. He was a driver called Mickey Ball, and he was convicted, pleading guilty, and he got 5 years. There were 2 other people that were arrested. Gordon Goody, he's on the bottom left, and Buster Edwards, he's on the bottom right. And in the middle is Brian Field. Now, Brian Field was quite notorious at the time for being a little bit bent as far as a solicitor was concerned. He worked for a company called Wheaters in London, and at that time, a 12-person jury had to come back with a unanimous yes or no, guilty or not guilty. So what Brian Field would do, he would nobble one of the jury, and that guy would hold out for a nice little fee, and the whole case would collapse and the guys would be set free. And that's exactly what happened to Goody and Edwards. But they were 2 stalwarts of the bowler hat gang. And a little bit later, in early '63, Brian Field was approached by a Royal Mail security officer. Brian Field was not the top solicitor of the practice. He was just the solicitor's clerk. And this guy was called the Ulsterman. We think we know his name. Well, we do know his name, but we're not really supposed to say it because he never went through the course. So you just accept it for that. But the Ulsterman approached him and said, "Do you know anybody that would like to rob a train?" And Brian Field said, "Well, yeah, possibly. I'll have a talk with somebody over it." And about a week or so later, Gordon Goody and Buster Edwards called to the office. They met the Ulsterman for the first time, the first of 4 times, not just him a bit later, some of the others were involved as well. But what the Ulsterman told them was that it was a good thing, pick a certain time and a certain day, and it would be a very, very good job to do. So these were the assembled. You see Gordon Goody and Buster Edwards in the middle. On the right, you see Charles Wilson. He was the treasurer. He was holding the 62,000 from the raid on the BOAC building, which was going to be used to finance the Great Train Robbery. The head of the gang was Napoleon. On the left, Bruce Reynolds. But they realised they would have to bring some other people in. They would have to bring in enforcers. And enforcers were people that were put there to make people do what they should do. And Ronnie Biggs was a friend of Bruce Reynolds. He'd met him in jail before, and he was used to, well, not him exactly, but there were some others as well. And they'd never stopped a train before, and they didn't know how to do it. But Reynolds knew of a guy called Roger Caudry, and he had a gang on the South Coast called the South Coast Raiders, and they had been very good at extracting money from British Railways by various means, and stopping trains was one of them. So they approached Roger and they said to him, "Would you stop the train for us?" And he said, "Yes, I will do that, no problem. But I am head of a gang, and we made a pact that nobody would go out on their own. So if you employ me, you employ the rest of the gang as well." Now, this caused a bit of not ill feeling a little bit amongst Reynolds and his cohorts there, because it was starting to get too big. And when I say too big, this is the number of people. There are 3 slides here. This is the Southwest Gang. That's the Southwest London, which was the bowler hat gang that had done BOAC. The only one that's missing was the one that was in jail. Okay, and that was Nicky Bourne. You can see their age in the early 30s. You can see how they died, some of them. Mr. Wilson later on was assassinated. More about that later. You could see their split. They got 1/17, which was £147,000. Some say it was 150,000, but either way, it was a lot of money. And you can see on the right there what they did when they got sentenced. The majority of them got 30 years, which was reduced on appeal to 25. And this was the associates of the gang that were needed to do certain jobs, and so like a train stopper, a quartermaster to make sure they had the supplies at a place called Leatherslade Farm, where they were going to stay after the job was done. There's the solicitors at the bottom, Wheater and Brian Field. And if you notice on the right-hand side, a few of them even got acquitted. So we'll come to those in a minute. These were the South Coast Raiders. These were the guys down south that were known to take money from British Rail. There's a couple of them in burgundy colour, Danny Pembroke and Stan Aggett, and they didn't get caught at all. But again, more about that later. There were some accomplices. So the Ulsterman, he would have been paid a drink, as they called it, quite a substantial amount of money. He informed Napoleon and the rest of the gang that the real carriage to centre on was the second carriage past the engine. That held all the high value items. And they picked the 8th of August because bank holiday in Scotland was the first week in August. And by the time the money had generated through the banks, some of it was torn and tattered. It would go to disposal. Others would go into banks in London and vice versa. There was a lot of money being generated that would be going through on the train. There's the Wheaters. John Wheater was the head of the solicitor firm. He lived in a very austere little house. He had a right banger of a car, and he couldn't understand why his solicitor's clerk lived in a fantastic house, married with nice posh cars of high value, high end. Brian Field's wife was Karen, and she was part of it. She became a driver and a facilitator at Leatherslade Farm. So while Leatherslade Farm was purchased, and that went through the solicitors' company, Wheater and Field, the facilitators would make sure that all the goods and bits and pieces were there. Mark, we don't know his surname. Well, we probably do, but because he didn't get caught, that's never been put through. He failed the cleansing because the idea was that he was going to rub off all the fingerprints that things that they'd used at Leatherslade Farm and then burn Leatherslade Farm. But he realised that really that was the police were getting a bit close, and he got his £10,000 in his pocket, and basically he ran away. Lenny Field was just an ordinary guy that they knew, and he became the purchaser of Leatherslade Farm. He didn't have to pull out any money. In fact, he got paid £12,000. But they had to put a name on the documents, and it was his name that was used to buy Leatherslade Farm. William Boll, he's the guy with the spectacles there. and he was an engineer, so all the electrics that we're going to see in a second, and bits and pieces, cars, anything like that, batteries, whatever, he would be involved with. Hop was a friend of Ronnie Biggs. He'd worked for him. Ronnie Biggs was a carpenter, and he worked for Pop, and he found out he was a train driver, and they needed a train driver, so they employed Pop. That didn't work very well, and he wasn't happy with things, and he walked away without a penny. And they even had a welfare department. Mary Manson had been a long-term girlfriend of Bruce Reynolds, and she was married now, and she was the go-to point, the phone number, if any of the families got into financial difficulties. They could ring Mary, and she had a slush fund to help them out of their problems. So, the Royal Mail travelling post offices. We don't have any today, but on the train, on the network in 1963, there were 49 of them, and they were doing fantastic work. It was a good way of the post office distributing their mail in those times. All our mail these days goes by air and road, except when there's problems. They will put sacks of mail on the train, but they've all been sorted in the sorting offices that are spread around the country, the big ones like Wolverhampton and Birmingham.
Not today, they're all on strike.
Well, okay. Okay. So the second carriage was the one that they were going to be centering on, because that held the high value packages. The post office did consider alarms and radios, but that was considered too expensive. And the high value carriage was retained after the Great Train Robbery for 7 years before being torched at Norwich. The carriage was towed to Norwich, and with the insurance people, post office, transport police and the police as well, they made sure that nobody would get mementos from it, and they just set light to it, and it disintegrated, and that was it. That was the end of the main carriage. Now I'm going to be talking about stopping the train. They'd never done this before as a main, but Roger Caudry was very good at it. If I do my Tommy Cooper act, made by my own fair hands, you will note underneath the screen. Right. This is a 12-volt battery. The 12-volt battery that would power really a motorcycle these days, a big motorcycle, but it's the same voltage, 12-volt, that you've got on your car. Obviously, it's not so powerful. The batteries in those days would be a pack about so big to actually get the power that was needed. But as the train, and they could hear the train in the early morning at the other side of Lake Buzzard, and as the train started to descend down the track, what they did was that they would set up on a battery a light bulb about 200 yards north of Sears Crossing. Now, we'll see that in a minute, if I can set this up. This piece of wire would be about 30, 40 metres long, something like that. It trailed down to the track, and the idea was that they would leave it with a light, and then it would be shone behind an amber light. Now, the lights on the train tracks are different from what we do on the roads. As you'll see, sometimes they're in stacks of 3, so red, amber, green, or in this case, green is at the top and red is at the bottom, different from the road. And the big thing about an amber light on the railway is the train driver is allowed to slowly drive through an amber light, but be prepared to stop. On British roads, we try and get through the amber light as quick as we can, but we shouldn't, but we're there again. So what was happening, the idea of this and the way they did it was really quite canny, because if they broke the circuit of the lights in the box, it would show up at the signal box. So they didn't do that. Now the light would be on green. And what they did is they didn't want a green light, they wanted a red one. So what they simply did was hide it with a glove. And in hiding it with a glove, they put a light bulb underneath with the battery onto the bulb that would have been actually in there, and it would have shone up as a red light underneath. And the guy in the signal box would know absolutely no difference whatsoever. Nothing has been cut, it's just been changed. And that's exactly what they did. When the train got to Crewe, there was a mass change. The sorters would then go back on the train that was coming up from London to go towards Glasgow, and a new crew, a driver and a second man, or a fireman as they were called from the old days of steam. And the guy that got in the cab, as you probably remember, was Jack Mills. And we get to this place called Sears Crossing. About 200 yards from that, the amber light had been set. It had been set by a guy called Daly. And basically, as he set it, he would then flash back. So if the train is coming towards me, those lights would be behind in that direction. He would shine back with just a torch, a couple of flashes to say that the trap was being set. And then the guy further along down at Sears Crossing would set it to this yellow, to this red, by just covering the green bulb with a glove. It's that simple. And I think if Bruce Reynolds had known that, Napoleon had known that, I don't think he'd have employed the South Coast Raiders at all. He wouldn't have needed them. When they came up to the red light, he had to stop. And when he stopped, the second man, David Whitby, got out to find out from a line side phone what the problem was from the signalman. When he got there, he did find that the lines had been cut and that the phone wouldn't work. So he walked back to the carriage, to Jack Mills, the driver, and as he's climbing in, that's when the men like Ronnie Biggs and the enforcers overpowered the train, and they put Pop, Stan Aggett, his name was, and said, right, now drive the train. And he looked at them and he said, I'm a shunting driver. I know nothing about how you would drive this type of train. This is brand new. I don't really know. So at that point, I think Mr. Biggs got a little bit irate, but anyway, he was grabbed and pulled out, and they put back in Jack Mills. Now, Jack tried to put a bit of a fight up, and he was overpowered, and he got struck, and that's why he's got this famous picture of him with a bandaged head. It did shake both of these guys. it did mean that the next few years of their life were very tempestuous. David Whitby only died at the age of 34. Jack went on for a few years more. If he'd have died earlier, then the people of the Great Train Robbery would have been done for murder. But he didn't, and living that extra life that he did have meant that they got away with that charge. Both crewmen were overpowered, and Jack was asked, look, you won't get hurt anymore. We promise you that if you do what I say. And he'd realised what he'd been through. He'd been struck already, and he drove the train further down the track, past the red light. By trailing some of these the first one especially, onto the track, the train would sever the light being shone because the wires would be severed. Jack Mills was forced to drive the train half a mile down to a place called Bredigo Bridge. And if you look at the film Robbery, which will be shown this year, that's the sort of picture you see. Before the bridge, the train was stopped and two guys came out of the bushes and uncoupled the rest of the train, the 10 carriages from the 2 carriages, and then they overpowered the staff in the second carriage where all the high value items were. The engine with the HPV was driven onto the bridge, the Bredigo Bridge, where 120 of the 128 sacks were chained down the banking into an Austin Roadster lorry. Now, for years after, there was a sign on the bridge saying this is Train Robbers Bridge, and then somebody at British Rail said, well, this isn't really that good for our PR, and we don't really want to call it Bredigo Bridge, so it's now called Mentmore Bridge, but it's exactly the same place. And if you go down the West Coast main line, Rugeley Trent Valley, Litchfield Trent Valley, Tamworth, down that line to Euston, you actually go over that bridge today.
I've been under it.
Have you?
Yeah, because my son lives in Buzzard.
Ah, that's right.
So we've been through it a few times.
Good, good.